If you're serious about getting started in video, you need the right camera. But depending on what style of videos you make, you want to make sure you have the right specs and features in your camera for that style of video. And the camera for one style of videos is completely different than another. Otherwise, you might get a camera that looks gorgeous, but is missing key features you need. So in this video, let's talk about the best beginner cameras for different shooting styles and budget levels. And as always, I'll leave links down below with the best pricing on all the cameras. So when it comes to video, filmmaking, or content creation, there are a few features you need to make sure your video camera has as a bare minimum requirement. So all of the cameras on this list will have the following features. And I quickly want to talk about these features so you know why these features are important and what they actually do. First up is 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. This will be your main shooting mode, and this will make sure that by shooting in 4K, you're able to get high quality and crisp video. And with 4K, you're also going to get the most amount of resolution that you can get in a beginner camera. And by using 4K, you can also crop your content for vertical format for TikTok or Instagram. And at the same time, you're also going to be able to use digital zoom-ins without losing a ton of detail like I'm doing right now. But depending on your style of videos, you might also want slow motion at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion or 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. And all of the cameras on this list do shoot 60 and 120 frames per second, but at different resolutions depending on the camera. Now, when your video comes straight from the camera, it usually doesn't look cinematic or have that professional pop. But there's two features you absolutely need to have in your camera if you really want your videos to shine. So the cameras on this list do have cinema profiles or log profiles to give you the most amount of flexibility and dynamic range with your cameras, both in terms of colors and light values. And for the most part, you also want to get 10-bit color. This is going to give you the most amount of color flexibility even without a cinema profile. However, if you don't have 10-bit color, you can still get away with 8-bit color if you have a cinema profile. Now, whether you're a beginner or a professional, you want to look for a camera that does most of the work for you. Therefore, you want to look for cameras with good autofocus. You don't have to futz around with your lens. And on top of that, you also want good stabilization for handheld video. But most importantly, you want to have a camera with good body and design, so it's easy to use and easy to change the settings around and switch up when you're in a fast-paced shooting environment. But these last few features are really specific to the camera model you're using, so we'll talk about these features when we talk about individual cameras. But now you know what features you need and why they're important. So let's talk about the first camera on this list, and that is the Sony ZV-E10. This is the best camera for someone that's a beginner and also on a tight budget. And it's the cheapest way to get almost all of the features you need for video. Starting with the fact that the ZV-E10 is a very small camera. It literally fits in the palm of your hands, making it an ideal camera for handheld shooting, and you can use this camera with a very affordable gimbal or stabilizer because it's so light. And the ZV-10 also has digital stabilization to help further smooth out all of your handheld movement. And yes, you can vlog with it. On top of that, it has a really simple button layout, making this camera ultra easy to use. It has one button to go between photo, video, and slow motion mode, and two separate record buttons for taking photos and video recording. And it also has a 3-capsule microphone built right into the camera, which is perfect for content creators and vloggers, and the audio from this microphone is shockingly solid. But for the best audio, you can also plug in an external microphone. And Sony also makes really compact shotgun mics for their Sony cameras that plug straight into the flash mount without needing any kind of wires. And like any good video camera, the ZV-E10 also has a side articulating screen, which is ideal for someone that wants to see themselves while filming, but also high angle and low angle shots. And with the screen on the back, you also have touch autofocus. And the ZV-E10 also has really good autofocus with face and eye detect. And the autofocus overall is fast and reliable without any sort of quirks or hunting, and it does a really good job with detecting faces and eyes, and overall, it's a really reliable autofocusing system. You're really not going to have problems with it, even if you're new to cameras. And a great thing about shooting on the ZV-E10, or really any Sony camera, is the Sony E-mount for lenses. This is going to give you access to all of Sony lenses, all of third-party lenses, and even the really cheap and affordable cinema lenses available on Amazon. You're going to have unlimited options with this camera because of that Sony E-mounts. However, one downside of the ZV-10 is that for a video camera, the battery life is pretty short, so I recommend having a few spares. On a single charge, you'll get about 40 minutes of continuous video shooting. But if you're someone that's doing a sit-down talking head video in a studio like this, you can also power this camera via the USB-C port, and it will also charge your batteries. Now, one of the most important things when it comes to choosing the right video camera for you is that it has to look pretty. So let's talk about my favorite thing about cameras and also one of the most important, the sensor. The ZV-E10 has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, but it's not just a typical sensor. The sensor is also very, very good in low lights. If you're a beginner, chances are you're probably just shooting with available light, which is usually very dim. And if you do have lights, they're probably very small. By having a camera that's good at high ISO, you can get a lot more power out of those small lights and make your dim available light go a lot further. The ZV-E10 looks pretty good up to 3200 ISO, but you can easily push this up to 6400 ISO and clean up the noise in post-production. And the ZV-E10 also has the updated Sony color science, which has better color saturation and also looks better for skin tones. And when we're talking about colors, it also has the most important feature you need in your camera to make it look cinematic or professional, and that is S-Log3 and Hybrid Log Gamma, which are the ideal color profiles to shoot on for maximum dynamic range, color flexibility, and clean results at high ISOs. Basically, it's going to give you the best results by using these color profiles. However, the ZV-E10 only has 8-bit color instead of 10-bit color, but because we have cinema profiles in this camera, we should be just fine if we color grade our videos properly. And naturally, the ZV-E10 also meets the minimum requirements for a good beginner video camera by having 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. But there's actually something special about the 4K in the ZV-E10. It's also downsampled from 6K because it uses all of the pixels on the sensor and essentially takes the 6K image from the 24 megapixel sensor and squeezes it down into a more manageable and easier to edit 4K file. This essentially means you'll have a 4K file with 6K quality and detail. And the ZV-E10 also has full HD at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion and 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. Slow motion is a really good tool to have to get more interesting and more dynamic shots. This is really useful for music videos, content creators, or basically anyone that wants to shoot something epic. As a beginner video camera for vloggers, content creators, filmmakers, or anything else, the ZV-E10 pretty much has it all. The body alone comes at a really phenomenal price, and it's the best option for someone on a budget. Now, if you're someone that's really serious about video and maybe your budget isn't quite as tight and you really want to push the limits with your creativity, chances are you're going to find yourself pretty limited with a budget camera like the Sony ZV-E10. And in order to really get the kind of results you want, you're probably going to need better specs. But if you want pro-level specs without having to pay pro-level prices and wreck your bank account, there's actually still one camera that's relatively affordable and gives you all the specs you need, and that is the Sony A6700. It has a 26 megapixel APS-C size sensor that's actually the same sensor from the pro-level Sony FX30, so you're actually going to get the exact same quality as a legit cinema camera without having to pay cinema camera prices. Plus, it also has a dual native ISO of 640 and 2500. At 2500, this camera is completely clean and you can still push it beyond that. So while the ZV-E10 does a pretty good job in low light and high ISO, the A6700 is going to absolutely blow you away. And it also has the latest version of the Sony AI-based autofocus, which can intelligently recognize subject matter like people, animals, cars, birds, insects, and the list goes on. It's super fast, super reliable. There's zero quirks or hunting with this autofocus. And in my experience, it's actually better than you managing autofocus yourself because you have a dedicated chip on this camera managing autofocus for you. And this is the same autofocusing system from the Sony A7R5, which is like a $6,000 camera. Plus, it also has 7 stops of 5-axis stabilization with active stabilization. And comparing active stabilization compared to no stabilization, the results are dramatic. It's basically like having a gimbal inside of your camera. And it also has the latest Sony color science with S-Log3 and cinema profiles, and it also has something known as S-Cinetone, which is meant to be a beginner-friendly version of a cinema profile that's really easy to grade. You do lose 1 stop of dynamic range with this profile, but it's an easy trade-off to make for this filmic look. And it also has 10-bit color in every single frame rate, giving you the gold standard for a beginner video camera. Now, in terms of frame rates, it of course has 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, but it also has 4K at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion. And on top of that, it's also downsampled from 6K in every single frame rate, basically giving you 6K detail and clarity across the entire board of frame rates. And of course, it still does full HD at 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. But one feature when it comes to slow motion that I'm really excited about is that the A6700 can also shoot 4K at 120 frames per second for 5 times slow motion. But there is one downside. In the slow motion mode, you also have a 1.6 times crop, which is pretty heavy and it zooms your image way in, already cropping your already small APS-C size sensor, and 4K at 120 frames per second is also a little bit noisier. So it's not a mode that you probably want to use as your main shooting mode, but it's a really useful tool to have for getting some epic glamour shots or tighter detail shots. Now, in terms of body and design, this is where the A6700 really stands out for me. It's built like a traditional mirrorless camera and has a lot more complicated modes, buttons, and dials on it that might make your head spin a little bit if you're new to cameras, but it does have some pretty nice advantages. If you're working with this camera, you're probably making legit projects. You're probably not just making talking head videos like this. You're probably making music videos, commercials, short films, or something really cool. And for that, you need to be able to work fast and efficient. The A6700 actually has 2 custom buttons on it that you can pretty much program anything to. You can use it to bring up your picture profiles, autofocus modes, or anything that fits your shooting style, and this is going to help you work a lot faster. On top of that, it has a mode dial that also has 3 custom presets. You can set this up for 4K 24, 4K 60, 4K 120, or 4K at low light, and with this you can quickly switch to the mode that you need for that specific shot. And it also has a dedicated selector to go between regular video and a dedicated slow motion mode where you slow the video down for you in camera. This is going to be really useful if you want to get some quick real-time shots and then get a slow motion shot at the end of it. And the side articulating screen on the A6700 is also 100% touch sensitive. So not only do you get touch autofocus, but you get complete control over your camera. You can use it to change over your menus and also change your major settings like shutter, ISO, and aperture. Now, I have to address the elephant in the room. The rumors of this camera overheating are greatly exaggerated. When this camera first launched, it did have some overheating issues. After the firmware release, those overheating issues are pretty much all gone if you use this camera with your temperature setting set to high. You can easily get over an hour of 4K at 24 and maybe about 45 minutes at 4K at 60 frames per second, but chances are you're not really going to be shooting for that long in one take. And if you do have any sort of overheating issues, you can easily pick up a pretty affordable $40 to $60 external fan that will solve all of your overheating issues. So I have to say, overheating is not an issue with this camera. And even if it did overheat, when you consider the raw horsepower of the A6700 with 4K downsampled in every frame rate up to 60 frames per second, 4K at 120 even though it has a crop, plus S-Log3 and S-Cinetone for color grading and the world-class autofocus and stabilization, plus the amazing body and design that's going to help you work faster and more efficiently, the A6700 is an absolute steal for the price, and it's probably the best camera to get for a beginner video maker, filmmaker, content creator, or someone that just does video. But whether you're getting the Sony ZV-E10 or the A6700, you want to make sure you get the best price possible. So you want to check out the links in the description down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.